So, what would it actually take to kidnap a sitting president? I mean, a real full-scale military operation designed to capture a world leader. It sounds like something out of a movie, right? Well, our source material lays out a shocking hypothetical scenario of just that. Let's dive in and break down exactly how it would supposedly go down.
Okay, so picture this. The scene is set in the dead of night. It's 2 a.m., January 3rd, 2026. Somewhere in a control room in Florida, operators are glued to a series of screens, watching a live feed of something happening thousands of miles away.
That live feed, it's showing a high-stakes military operation unfolding in real time. We're talking about Caracas, Venezuela. And the target, who's sound asleep in his bed, completely unaware, is none other than the nation's president.
And you might be asking, who's watching all this happen from that control room? Well, the source material claims it was then President Donald Trump himself, and his supposed reaction to it all? He was later quoted as saying, "It was just like watching television." Just think about that for a second. A truly surreal comment for such a mind-blowing event.
So how do you even pull something like this off? How would an operation like this actually go down? Well, the source material lays out a very precise 5-step plan for this midnight raid.
Okay, this thing is described as a full-on, multi-pronged attack. First, you've got stealth helicopters flying just 100 feet above the ocean, totally off the radar. Then, boom, a cyber attack hits and the entire capital city of Caracas is plunged into darkness. Right after that, airstrikes take out all the air defense and radar systems, and with the path cleared, Delta Force commandos descend on President Nicolas Maduro's residence. The source claims the whole thing was over in a flash. He was captured in less than 5 minutes and airlifted right out of the country. I mean, talk about a stunningly swift operation.
Now, obviously, you can't just go and abduct a world leader without giving some kind of reason, right? You need a public justification. And in this hypothetical scenario, the official story the administration went with was simple. It was direct. It was all about drugs.
And they didn't just pull this out of thin air. The whole justification was built on a legal framework. A formal indictment was actually filed in New York, charging Maduro with the whole laundry list of really serious crimes. We're talking narco-terrorism, cocaine importation conspiracies, even charges of helping drug traffickers going back decades. So on the surface, this whole thing is framed as a big law enforcement action, right? Just arresting a wanted man. But our source material brings up a really important point and asks a crucial question. Does the actual data, the facts on the ground, really support this story? And this is where the official story starts to get a little shaky. According to the source, it points out that, yeah, Venezuela is a transit point for cocaine, but most of that stuff is actually headed to Europe. Now compare that to a country like Guatemala. In just 1 year, 2018, they shipped a whopping 1,400 metric tons, and guess where it was headed? Primarily to the USA. So the source asks a pretty logical question. If the real goal was to stop drugs from getting into America, why on earth would you target Venezuela?
And that one question leads us directly to the source's central argument for what was really going on. The claim is, it was never about the drugs. It was always about the oil.
And when we talk about oil in Venezuela, the numbers are just staggering. Venezuela is sitting on the largest proven crude oil reserves in the entire world. That's more than Saudi Arabia. Let that sink in. We're talking over 300 times billion barrels of oil.
So, to really get a grip on this oil motive, the source says you have to look at the history. For decades, big American oil companies were all over Venezuela. But that all came to a screeching halt when Hugo Chavez came to power. In 2001, he nationalized the entire oil industry, which basically kicked those American companies out. And that one move, our source argues, is what set the stage for years and years of tension and U.S. sanctions.
The source material really drives this oil argument home with another quote it attributes to Donald Trump, supposedly said the day after the raid. He allegedly said, "It was the greatest theft in the history of America. They took oil away from us." And the source points out, think about that language. To call a country taking control of its own natural resources a theft from America? Well, that's pretty telling, isn't it?
All right, so let's say this actually happened. You've just abducted the president of a sovereign nation. How is the rest of the world going to react? Let's take a look at the international fallout as described in our source material.
To put it mildly, the reaction was not good.
The condemnation was apparently swift and came from all over the globe. You had a whole coalition of countries, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Spain, issuing a joint statement calling it a dangerous precedent. The UN Secretary General flat out called it a violation of the UN Charter. And of course, other major powers like China and Russia condemned the action too.
So, with all this global outcry, what was the administration's response? According to the source, they tried to frame it not as an act of war, but simply as a law enforcement function. You know, just arresting a guy who's been indicted. But does that label really fit when you look at how the operation was carried out?
Well, let's look at the facts presented in the source. To arrest one person, this so-called law enforcement function involved over 150 military aircraft, and they were launched from 20 different bases. That is an absolutely insane amount of military hardware for what they're calling a simple arrest.
And then you have the human cost. The source reports that those initial airstrikes, the ones to clear the way, killed 40 people. So this really brings up a critical question. Can you honestly call an action with this level of military force and this much collateral damage law enforcement? The legal problems didn't just stop at the international level either. The source argues that this whole operation also broke American law. See, the U.S. Constitution is pretty clear you need congressional approval to go to war. But in this scenario, that approval was never even asked for. And that, as you can imagine, apparently led to calls for impeachment from lawmakers back in the States. And all of this brings us to our final, and maybe the most important question of all. What does an act like this mean for the rest of the world? What are the long-term consequences?
See, at the very heart of how countries are supposed to interact, there's the UN Charter. Specifically, Article 2, Paragraph 4. It basically says you can't use force against another country's independence or its territory. It's a fundamental rule. And this hypothetical operation is presented as a complete and total violation of that core principle.
Ultimately, the source concludes that an action like this really exposes a certain worldview. It's a worldview that can be summed up like this: rules are for the weak. The powerful can do whatever they want. It suggests a world where might makes right is the only rule that matters, and international law is just optional.
And so that leaves us with one final, and honestly pretty chilling question. If a superpower can just decide, on its own, to abduct another world leader, to just snatch them from their own capital city in the middle of the night, then what happens to the whole idea of a rules-based international order? What does that mean for every other country in the world?